A quiet, peaceful town stood under a bright, clear sky. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where kids ran through the streets, their laughter filling the air, and neighbors waved as they passed by. The park at the heart of the town was a safe haven for families. Children often spent their afternoons there, playing on the swings, climbing the jungle gym, or running around with their friends. It was one of those rare places where everyone felt a sense of calm and comfort. On one particular afternoon, the sun shone brightly, and the park was no different. A young girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, was playing alone. She had a small ball in her hand, tossing it gently in the air as she chased after it. Her sneakers kicked up dust from the path as she ran, her face glowing with excitement and joy. She didn't mind being alone. She was used to playing by herself. She loved the peaceful feeling of being in the open air, with the soft rustle of leaves and the sound of distant birds chirping. But on this afternoon, something was different. A police car, its siren barely audible from a distance, pulled up at the edge of the park. The girl glanced over, noting the officer who stepped out of the vehicle. She had seen him around before but never paid much attention. He was just another figure in a uniform, someone who was always around but never directly involved in her life. But today, for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt a little uneasy. There was something about the way the officer moved that made her feel a slight shiver run down her spine. The officer glanced over at her, his eyes narrowing. Without saying a word, he made his way toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The girl, sensing something was off, stopped in her tracks. She clutched her ball a little tighter, unsure of what to do. The park had always been a safe place, but this officer was different from the others who usually walked around the area. There was something unsettling about his presence. "Hey you," the officer called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "What do you think you're doing here all alone?" The girl hesitated for a moment before replying, her voice small but steady. "I'm just playing with my ball." The officer looked her up and down, his gaze cold and calculating. "You're alone, aren't you?" he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "That's dangerous. You shouldn't be out here by yourself." The girl felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she nodded, not knowing how to respond. She wasn't used to being scolded by strangers, especially not by someone in a uniform. She had never seen this officer before, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Without warning, the officer reached into the back of his patrol car and pulled out a large, intimidating police dog. The dog's eyes were fierce, its muscles rippling as it stepped out of the vehicle. The officer gave a sharp command and the dog immediately barked, its deep voice echoing in the still air. "Come on, boy," the officer said, motioning for the dog to follow him. "We've got work to do." The girl's heart began to race. She had never been around a police dog before, and the sight of the animal's sharp teeth and powerful build made her feel incredibly vulnerable. The dog's eyes locked onto hers and it took a step forward, growling low in its throat. "Stay back," the officer ordered the girl, his voice suddenly harsh. "This dog is here to teach you a lesson." Confused and frightened, the girl took a step back, her eyes never leaving the dog. She had no idea what the officer meant by teaching a lesson, but she could tell it wasn't something good. The dog's growl deepened, its posture tense and threatening. "Now listen carefully," the officer said, his words sharp. "This dog is trained to follow orders. If you don't want him to bite, you'll need to follow my instructions." The girl stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. She had never been in a situation like this before. The dog's growl sent chills down her spine, and the officer's tone made it clear that this wasn't a friendly visit. "I want you to make the dog stop," the officer continued.
"Bite me, do it now." The girl's breath caught in her throat.
Her mind raced, but she couldn't understand what the officer was asking of her. What do you mean?" she whispered. The officer's face darkened with frustration. "I said bite me. The dog won't stop until you do. Show me you're in control." The command felt wrong, something deep within her telling her that it was not how things should be. She didn't want to hurt anyone, let alone a police officer. The officer seemed to sense her hesitation and took a step closer, intimidating her further. "Don't make me repeat myself," he growled. "Do it now or else." The girl's hands trembled as she clenched the ball tighter. She didn't want to obey, but fear held her in place. The officer was a figure of authority, and he had the dog at his side. She felt powerless, trapped in a situation where nothing made sense. Before she could react, the officer suddenly released the dog, giving it another command. The dog lunged forward, its teeth bared, and the girl screamed in terror. She didn't know what to do, her legs frozen in place. The dog, like a whirlwind, was upon her in an instant. With all her strength, the girl pushed the dog away, but its jaws were quick, grabbing her by the sleeve of her shirt. The sharp teeth bit into her arm, drawing a small amount of blood. Her body shook with fear and her breath came in short gasps. "Do it! Bite me!" the officer shouted, his anger rising. The pressure was unbearable. Her eyes blurred with tears as she tried to push the dog away, her small hands powerless against its strength. In that moment, she felt utterly helpless. Her world had turned upside down, and the fun, carefree afternoon she had been enjoying just moments ago now felt like a distant memory. And then, just as things seemed like they couldn't get worse, a loud voice rang out, cutting through the tension in the air. "Hey, what the hell is going on here?" The officer turned, startled by the unexpected interruption. Standing at the edge of the park, a large figure emerged from the crowd that had begun to gather. It was a man, tall and muscular, with an unmistakable presence. It was Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, followed closely by another well-known figure, John Cena. The crowd parted as the two men made their way toward the officer, their expressions serious and determined. The Rock's voice boomed as he approached the officer, and the crowd could feel the shift in the air. The girl's eyes widened with hope as the two famous figures stepped into the scene. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare would end. The officer looked at them, his face full of disbelief. "This doesn't concern you," he said, his tone defensive. But the Rock wasn't backing down. "It does now," he said, his voice firm and commanding. "Let her go." John Cena stepped forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. He placed a hand on the officer's shoulder, gently but firmly, and added, "You've crossed the line." The officer hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The tension was palpable, and the crowd, once silent, began to murmur with anticipation. Would this be the moment when everything changed? The dog, still growling and eager to attack, paused for a moment, sensing the change in the air. The girl, though still shaken, looked up at the two men, her heart racing with hope. Could she finally be free of this nightmare? Would these unexpected heroes be enough to stop the officer and his dog? The answer was yet to come, but for the first time since the officer's arrival, the girl felt a glimmer of relief. The nightmare was far from over, but it was about to take a turn she hadn't expected. The scene in the park was tense, a quiet energy hanging in the air, broken only by the distant sound of the dog's low growl. The Rock and John Cena had arrived, and the officer, who had been so confident just moments before, now stood unsure of what to do. His eyes flickered nervously between the two famous men and the little girl, who was still trembling, her sleeve torn from the dog's bite. The girl, though still frightened, felt something change in the air, the fear that had gripped her for so long. That terrible feeling of helplessness began to ease. She looked up at the Rock and Cena, their presence powerful, comforting. They weren't just strangers rushing to her aid. They were figures of strength and justice, people she had seen on television, larger than life. The Rock's voice was calm, but there was a fierce authority in it. "I said, let her go," he repeated, stepping closer to the officer. His large, muscular frame loomed over the officer, who, despite his uniform and badge, suddenly seemed small. The officer took a step back, clearly taken aback by the situation. His hand hovered nervously near his belt where his radio was clipped. He wasn't used to being confronted in this way. He had thought he could control the situation with his dog, with his badge, with his uniform. But now two men who had an entire crowd's attention were standing between him and the girl, and for the first time he felt vulnerable. John Cena, his demeanor calm but unwavering, took another step forward, putting a hand on the officer's arm. "You've crossed the line, man. This isn't how you treat people, especially not a child." The officer flinched slightly, his face reddening with embarrassment. He had thought he was in charge, that no one would question his authority. But the truth was, he hadn't expected anyone to stand up to him, especially not like this. The crowd, which had grown steadily as word spread, now murmured in agreement. People began pulling out their phones, filming the moment, recording the confrontation. The officer, feeling the weight of the public's gaze on him, hesitated. The power he once held over the situation was slipping away. The girl's heart raced, but she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The dog, though still eyeing her, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. It stopped growling and stepped back, its body language now uncertain. The girl took a deep breath, but her arm throbbed where the dog had bitten her, and she instinctively pressed her hand to it, wincing in pain. The Rock turned his attention to her.
Hey, you all right?
He asked gently, crouching down to her level. His voice was soothing, and she could see the kindness in his eyes. She nodded, though her hands were still shaking.
I'm okay,
she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she truly was. The pain from the bite was still there, but it was the fear that gripped her the most. The fear of not knowing what had just happened, of feeling like she had been at the mercy of someone who didn't care. Good, the Rock said, offering a reassuring smile. He stood up and looked back at the officer. Now let's make sure this little one gets the help she needs. Cena, his eyes still locked on the officer, spoke next. You don't get to scare people like that. You don't get to intimidate a kid into doing something she's not capable of. You're supposed to protect people, not put them in danger. The officer stood frozen, his hands now hanging limply at his sides. He had no response. How could he? The weight of his actions was settling in, and for the first time he was starting to understand just how wrong everything had gone. He had let his power go to his head, thinking that just because he wore a badge, he could control the situation however he pleased. Meanwhile, the crowd, once silent and uncertain, was now reacting more openly. Some people were shouting in disbelief. Others were offering support to the girl. Whispers of unbelievable and this is wrong spread like wildfire. The community had witnessed something shocking, something they never thought would happen in their peaceful town. The girl's family, who had rushed to the park after hearing about the incident, now arrived on the scene. Her mother, looking frantic and scared, pushed her way through the crowd, calling out her daughter's name. "Sweetheart," her mother cried, rushing to her side. She knelt beside the girl, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Are you okay? What happened?" The girl, her voice trembling, recounted the events in a rush. He let the dog attack me. He told me to make it stop, but I couldn't," she said, her eyes wide with fear. Then the Rock and John Cena showed up. Her mother hugged her tighter, brushing her daughter's hair away from her face. "You're safe now. You're okay," she whispered, soothing her. Her mother looked up, her gaze darkening as she turned to the officer. "You did this? To my little girl?" The officer, still stunned by the sudden turn of events, avoided her gaze. He didn't know what to say. The Rock stepped forward again, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "We need to get her checked out," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Make sure everything's all right." "I'll take care of that," her mother replied quickly, standing up and supporting her daughter. She glanced at the officer one more time, the anger in her eyes barely contained. This won't go unpunished. With that, her mother helped the girl walk away from the scene. The Rock and Cena stayed close by, ensuring the officer didn't try anything else. As the crowd began to disperse, the murmurs of disbelief and frustration continued. The officer was left standing alone, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. His mind raced with confusion and regret. How had he let things get so out of hand? He had tried to intimidate a child, tried to force her into something she couldn't do. And now, in front of the entire town, he had failed. Behind him, a few of the bystanders continued to film, their phones capturing every moment. The officer's reputation, once untouchable, was now in ruins. There was no going back from this. The community would never look at him the same way again. As the tension in the air began to dissipate, the Rock and Cena exchanged a look. The situation had been handled for now, but they knew it wasn't over. The little girl, though physically unharmed for the most part, had just experienced something that no child should ever go through. She would need support and the community would need answers. "Let's make sure she's okay," Cena said quietly, his voice serious. "Agreed," the Rock replied. "We can't let this slide." The two men turned and followed the girl and her mother, walking toward the nearby clinic where the girl would get checked out. The officer was left behind, his mind swirling with the consequences of his actions. His day had gone from one of authority to one of humiliation in a matter of minutes. And he knew, deep down, that the consequences of what he had done were far from over. The crowd began to thin out, but the feeling of unease lingered in the air. People were talking, sharing their opinions on what they had witnessed. This was not just an ordinary day in the park. It was a day that would change the town, and everyone who had witnessed it forever. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to dip lower in the sky. But the shadow of what had happened would not fade so easily. For the officer, for the girl, and for everyone who had been part of this strange and terrible encounter, the path ahead would be a long one. The clinic was quiet, a small, unassuming place tucked on the edge of the town. The kind of place where people came to get their routine checkups, the walls lined with charts and comforting posters about healthy living. But today there was an unusual tension in the air as the little girl and her mother walked through the doors, with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and John Cena following closely behind them. The Rock's voice, steady and reassuring, broke the silence. "You're in good hands now," he told the girl, his smile warm but protective. She gave a small nod, still holding her mother's hand, though the fear that had overwhelmed her earlier was slowly fading. There was comfort in knowing that she was no longer alone in the situation. The heroes she had seen on TV now stood beside her, ready to help her through this nightmare. John Cena, walking beside them, offered a soft smile. "You did good," he said quietly. "You stayed strong, and that's not easy in a situation like that." The girl gave him a weak smile, but her mind was still racing. What had just happened? How had things escalated so quickly? She didn't understand why the officer had treated her the way he did, and she didn't know why the dog had been let loose on her. All she knew was that it had been terrifying. Her mother, still holding her daughter close, walked up to the reception desk, her voice soft but filled with determination. "My daughter's been bitten by a dog," she explained. "We need to get her checked out." The nurse behind the desk looked up, her eyes widening in concern. "Of course, let me get you taken care of right away." She gestured for them to follow her to one of the private rooms in the back. The girl's mother looked back at the Rock and Cena, silently thanking them for being there. It was clear that they were more than just celebrities now. They were the people who had stepped up when no one else had. The room was small, but it felt comforting. A soft bed in the corner, a few chairs, and the gentle hum of the air conditioning filled the space. The nurse led them to the bed where the girl sat down carefully, still holding her arm where the dog had bitten her. As the nurse cleaned the wound, the girl tried to keep her breathing steady. It hurt, but it wasn't the pain from the bite that bothered her the most. It was the memory of the officer's voice, the command that had made her feel small and powerless, the sight of the dog attacking her. It had all happened so fast, and she still didn't understand why it had happened at all. Her mother stayed by her side, stroking her hair gently, trying to comfort her. "It's going to be okay," her mother murmured, though the worry in her eyes was clear. She wanted to believe that everything would be okay, but the truth was, she didn't know what would come next. What kind of world had they found themselves in, where a police officer would act like that? After a few minutes, the nurse finished cleaning the wound and applied a bandage. "There," she said with a smile. "You'll be fine. Just make sure to keep it clean and avoid any heavy activity for a while." The girl nodded, grateful for the nurse's kindness. But her mind was still in turmoil. She wanted to ask so many questions, but she didn't even know where to start. Why had the officer done what he did? Why had he treated her like that? Why had he let the dog attack her? The Rock, sensing her unease, spoke up. "We're going to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug," he said, his voice firm. "What happened to you today was wrong. No one should ever treat someone like that, especially not a child." John Cena nodded in agreement. "We'll make sure the right people hear about this. You're not alone in this." The girl looked up at them, her eyes wide. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. "We mean that we're going to make sure this officer is held accountable for what he did," The Rock explained. "And we're going to make sure that no one else has to go through what you did." Her mother looked at The Rock and Cena, her expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "You really think we can do something about this?" she asked. "I don't think," Cena replied, his voice steady. "I know. You don't have to face this alone anymore. We're going to make sure that officers' actions are investigated, and if what he did was wrong, he's going to face the consequences." The girl's mother let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly with relief. She had been so scared, not just for her daughter's safety, but for what would happen after. The idea of going up against a police officer, especially one who seemed so sure of himself, had seemed impossible. But now, with The Rock and Cena on their side, the weight didn't feel as heavy. The nurse, sensing the shift in the room, stepped out quietly, leaving them alone for a moment. The girl's mother took a deep breath, looking at her daughter with tender eyes. "You were so brave," she said. "I'm so proud of you." The girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the bandage on her arm, her fingers tracing the edges of it. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why would he do that? Why would the officer let the dog attack me?" The question hung in the air unanswered. The Rock and Cena exchanged glances, both of them uncomfortable with the truth they knew had to be faced. The fact that the officer had acted that way was something they couldn't explain. They had seen injustice before, but this was something different. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a person in a position of power abusing that power, using fear to control a little girl. "Some people misuse their power," The Rock said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "and sometimes they don't realize just how far they've crossed the line until it's too late." John Cena nodded. "It's up to people like us to make sure they're held accountable. That's how we make things right." The girl listened quietly, taking in their words. She still didn't fully understand what had happened, but she knew that she wasn't alone in facing it. She was no longer just a scared little girl in a park. She was someone who had people fighting for her, people who cared about what had been done to her, and that thought in its own way was a comfort. Her mother squeezed her hand gently. "We'll get through this together," she said. The Rock and Cena stayed with them for a little longer, offering words of encouragement, before they finally stood up to leave. "We'll be in touch," The Rock said. "We'll keep you updated on everything. Just know that you've got support." The girl looked up at them, her heart lighter than it had been all day. "Thank you," she whispered. With one last reassuring glance, they left the clinic, their promise to help still hanging in the air. The mother and daughter sat there for a while longer, talking softly, processing the day's events. But even as the shadows grew longer and the day turned into evening, the girl knew that things had changed. She had been afraid, but now she had hope. And in the midst of everything that had happened, that was the one thing she could hold on to. The days that followed felt long, stretching out as the little girl and her family waited for the investigation into the officer's actions to begin. It wasn't just the physical pain from the dog bite that weighed on her anymore. It was the emotional toll. The fear she had felt in the park, the terror of not knowing what would happen next, was something she couldn't shake. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the officer's cold stare and heard the dog's growl echoing in her mind. Her mother was worried too. The hospital visit had been routine, but the fear of what might come next never left her. What if the officer was never held accountable? What if he had done something like this before, or worse, had gotten away with it in the past? She couldn't let that happen. Her daughter deserved justice, and she would fight for it no matter what. Thankfully, The Rock and John Cena had kept their word. They stayed in touch regularly, updating the family on the progress of the investigation. The two men had used their platform to raise awareness, bringing attention to what had happened that day in the park. But despite their efforts, the wheels of justice turned slowly and the family had to endure the waiting. It wasn't easy, but they held on to the hope that things would change. One afternoon, a few days after the incident, there was a knock on the door. The girl's mother opened it, her heart racing with a mix of anticipation and fear. Standing on the doorstep was a man in a suit, holding a briefcase in his hand. He introduced himself as a representative from the department overseeing the officer's actions. "We've been looking into the matter," he said, his voice professional, but with a hint of concern in his eyes. "I'd like to speak with you about the investigation." Her heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. "Please come in," she said, stepping aside to let him in. They sat at the kitchen table, the representative explaining that the department had already started its internal investigation into the officer's conduct. The footage from the park, recorded by bystanders, had been reviewed and the evidence was clear. The officer's actions had been reckless and unjustifiable. There was no way to deny it. "We've already suspended the officer from active duty while we conduct a full investigation," the representative continued. "And we're looking into the possibility of charges, both for misconduct and for the harm done to your daughter." The mother let out a sigh of relief. Hearing that the officer had been suspended was a small victory, but it wasn't enough. She needed to hear more. "What about the dog? What happens to it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The representative nodded. "The dog has been removed from active duty as well. We're taking steps to ensure that no more harm comes from that animal, and it will undergo an evaluation to determine whether it should be retired or reassigned to another department." The news was better than she had expected, But there was still a part of her that couldn't rest until she saw true justice. "When can we expect this to be resolved?" she asked. "We're moving as quickly as we can, but this is a complicated case," the representative said. "We'll keep you updated every step of the way, and we're committed to ensuring that what happened in the park that day doesn't go unnoticed." The mother nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for listening, for doing something." The representative gave a reassuring smile. "We're here to help. We're just doing our jobs." As the man left, the weight of what had just happened settled on her shoulders. It wasn't over, not yet. But the first step had been taken. The officer had been suspended, the dog removed from duty, and the investigation was moving forward. It was a start, and for the first time in days, she felt like they might actually have a chance at justice. The girl, who had been listening quietly from the living room, stood up from the couch. Her mother's eyes met hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. But then the girl said, "Do you think it's really going to be okay?" Her mother smiled gently and walked over to her. She knelt down and took her daughter's hands in hers. "Yes," she said softly, "I do. It's not going to be easy, but we'll get through it. We're doing the right thing, and we have people on our side who are making sure we're heard." The girl nodded, though doubt still lingered in her heart. She wanted to believe her mother. She wanted to believe that things would work out. But the memory of that day, of the officer's coldness and the dog's growls, still haunted her. "We're not alone," her mother continued, sensing her daughter's unease. "We have people who care about us, who want to make sure this doesn't happen again. The Rock and Cena, they're not going to let this slip away." The girl looked up, a small flicker of hope in her eyes. "They're really helping?" Her mother smiled. "They are. They're making sure people hear our story so this officer can't hurt anyone else." As the days passed, the tension in the air began to lift slightly, though the uncertainty still hung over them. The Rock and Cena's public support continued to grow. Their voices were heard on social media, and news outlets picked up the story, spreading the word about what had happened in the park. Slowly, the officer's name began to be associated with scandal, his actions condemned by the public. But despite the growing momentum, the girl's family still faced the stress of the unknown. The investigation was moving forward, but it could take weeks, months even, before the full truth came out. One evening, as the sun began to set, the Rock called. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency to it. "Hey," he said, "we need to talk. There's been a development with the investigation." The girl's heart raced. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when they would finally get answers. "What is it?" her mother asked, her voice steady. "They're pressing charges," the Rock said. "The officer is facing serious consequences for what he did. We've been pushing hard, and it's finally paying off." The mother's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't the end yet, but it was a huge step in the right direction. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." "You don't have to thank me," the Rock replied. "This is about doing the right thing. And your daughter, she's the real hero here. She stood up when she didn't have to." The girl standing by her mother smiled shyly. "I didn't really do anything," she said. The Rock chuckled. "You did more than you think. You stood up to fear, and that's something a lot of people can't do." Her mother hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, but also a sense of hope for the future. "You're stronger than you know," she whispered. That night, as they sat together, the girl finally felt the fear begin to fade. She still didn't understand everything, but she knew that she was safe, and that the people who had stepped in to help her weren't going to let her down. Justice was on its way, and with it a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in days. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. And as the days passed, she knew that no matter what happened, she had the support of her family, The Rock, John Cena, and an entire community who was ready to stand up for what was right. The day of the hearing finally arrived. It felt like a weight had been lifted, but there was still a sense of tension in the air. The girl's family had been through so much, and now the final chapter of this ordeal was about to unfold. What would happen next? Would the officer truly face the consequences for what he had done? The fear that had clouded the girl's mind since the park incident was still there, but it was tempered with hope. She had come this far, and now it was time to see if the justice they had been fighting for would finally be served. The courthouse was busy, with people coming and going. their voices echoing off the marble floors. The girl's mother walked beside her, her hand resting gently on her daughter's shoulder. The presence of the Rock and John Cena gave them an extra sense of security, but the mother knew that today would be the real test. This was when everything would be decided. The outcome would determine not just the officer's future, but the future of everyone who had been affected by what had happened that day in the park. As they made their way into the courtroom, the girl's heart raced. She had never been inside a courthouse before, and the sight of all the people, the lawyers, the judge, and the crowd made everything feel overwhelming. It was a serious place where big decisions were made. She had been nervous since the moment she woke up, but she tried to push the fear aside. Today it wasn't just about her. It was about doing what was right for everyone, for every person who had ever been wronged in the same way. The girl sat beside her mother, feeling the coolness of the wooden bench beneath her. She held her hands tightly in her lap, staring ahead, trying to steady her breath. The Rock and Cena sat a few rows behind them, giving them space but still close enough to offer support. The room filled with a quiet murmur as people found their seats and waited for the hearing to begin. The officer, now facing the consequences of his actions, sat across from them. He looked different. Gone was the confidence he had shown in the park, replaced by an air of uncertainty. His uniform was crisp, but there was no denying the weight of the situation. His actions had brought him here, and now he would have to face the music. The girl noticed that he didn't make eye contact with anyone. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him look smaller than he had ever seemed before. As the judge entered the room, everyone stood in respect. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The judge took his seat and looked around the room, his eyes briefly meeting those of the girl's mother. The girl could feel the gravity of the moment, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment when everything would change. The judge cleared his throat and began. We are here today to address the actions of Officer Stevens, who has been accused of misconduct and abuse of power during an incident in the local park. The case has been reviewed thoroughly, and we are here to determine the appropriate consequences for his actions. The officer, who had been trying to remain calm, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't used to being on the other side of the law. For years he had worn his badge with pride, believing that his authority was unquestionable. But now, as the court's attention focused on him, he realized that his actions had betrayed everything he had stood for. The girl's mother, sitting next to her daughter, felt her heart race. She had been through so much already, and now she had to relive everything. The fear, the uncertainty, the helplessness. But she also knew that this moment was a turning point. This was the moment when things could be made right. The prosecutor stood up, ready to present the case. Your Honor, what happened that day in the park was not just an abuse of power. It was an assault. Officer Stevens took it upon himself to use his dog as a weapon against a defenseless child. The girl was not a threat to him or anyone else. He made a decision based on his own anger and desire to control, putting her life in danger. The room was quiet as the prosecutor continued. There are consequences for such actions, and today, we ask that Officer Stevens be held accountable for the harm he caused. We request that he face charges for misconduct and abuse of power. The girl's mother felt a surge of emotion. Hearing those words, hearing someone speak up for her daughter made everything feel real. It wasn't just a bad memory anymore, it was something that had to be addressed. There was justice, and it was within reach. The defense attorney stood up, attempting to defend the officer's actions. Your Honor, while I understand the gravity of this situation, I would ask the court to consider the context. Officer Stevens is a man who has served his community for years, and while his actions that day were regrettable, they were not malicious. He acted in the heat of the moment, and we ask for leniency in this matter. The defense's words seemed to fall flat in the courtroom. The Rock, sitting behind the girl, exchanged a look with Cena. The two men were both silent, but the anger in their eyes was clear. This wasn't a case of a mistake in the heat of the moment. It was a case of an officer using his position to hurt someone who was vulnerable. The judge listened carefully, taking in both sides before addressing the room. I have heard the arguments from both the prosecution and the defense. However, the evidence in this case is undeniable. Officer Stevens's actions that day were not an accident. They were a clear violation of his duty to protect and serve. As such, I find him guilty of misconduct and abuse of power." The girl's heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. The officer had been found guilty. For the first time, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't over, but it was a huge step in the right direction. The judge continued, "Officer Stevens, you will face disciplinary action from your department, including suspension without pay. Additionally, you will be required to undergo further training and evaluation before being allowed to return to duty. This is a chance for you to reflect on your actions and understand the consequences of abusing your authority." The officer's face turned pale. He was still silent, his eyes still focused on the floor. There was no denial now, no way to justify what had happened. He had been held accountable for his actions. The judge turned to the girl and her mother. "I want to acknowledge the bravery of the young girl who stood up in this case. You are not only an example of courage, but you are also an example of the strength it takes to fight for what is right. You have done a great service not just for yourself, but for everyone who might be vulnerable in a similar situation." The girl felt a warm rush of pride. Though she was still overwhelmed by the emotions of the day, her mother held her hand tightly, offering her silent support. This had been a long journey, but it was finally starting to feel like they were going to be okay. The hearing ended shortly after the judge's decision. The room began to empty out, but the girl and her family stayed behind, feeling the weight of the moment. The Rock and Cena walked over to them, their faces showing pride and relief. "We did it," The Rock said, his voice full of satisfaction. Justice was served. Cena smiled, his usual confident demeanor softened. "You were amazing. The real heroes today were you two. You showed the world that standing up for what's right is always worth it." The girl's mother hugged her tightly, whispering words of thanks to The Rock and Cena. They had been there for her and her daughter when they needed it most. And now, thanks to their support, they had a chance at healing. The officer, once a figure of authority, was left to face the consequences of his actions. The public's trust in him was shattered, and he would have to rebuild his life, learning the hard way that power could not be abused without consequences. As they left the courthouse, the girl finally allowed herself to smile. It was the first time in weeks that she felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but she had also faced it with strength. And in the end, that strength had led her to victory.